Yeah, so the Minister for Environment, Matthew Swinburne, the State Minister, has released the findings of the latest report into the Murujuga rock art on the Burrup Peninsula. And like I said, it does not paint a damning picture of what's going on there. And to me, it seems to set it up perfectly on a Friday afternoon, leading into next week, where the Federal Minister has to give approval or otherwise for the extension of the North West Shelf gas project. Let's look further into it, though, with Benjamin Smith, who is a University of Western Australia's world rock art expert, and he joins me on the line. Thanks for your time, Ben.
No, thanks for having me.
Okay, I don't know whether you've had more of a chance than I have, because, you know, I've been on radio, etc., to have a look at this report and what your reflection is on it.
Well, I've quickly skimmed through all 800 pages. The government has had, sat on this, as you know, the West Australian government sat on this for a year. Very unusual, very odd that it should be released on a Friday afternoon just before a minister is about to make a key decision on this, and just before UNESCO is about to make its decision on whether this is a World Heritage Site. The sitting on it for a year should raise your alarm bells.
Right. The science, though, of the people that have looked at this and come up with the conclusion that there's no data or no information to support the theories that it's being damaged by the emissions and by the industry on the Burrup. What do you say to that?
There's two aspects to this report. So there's an 800-page scientific report, and there's an executive summary. And I would urge your listeners to be very cautious. So the executive summary is what a lot of people read. And that executive summary appears to have been written more by a politician than a scientist, and it says nothing to see here, basically. But if you go into the depths of that 800-page report, which no doubt they hoped that we wouldn't have had time to do after 3 hours, you'll find some pretty worrying evidence in there, and also some very worrying omissions. And I'm going to talk about those this afternoon with you.
All right. Okay. Well, just explain, because I'm reading it in black and white here, that an initial determination, according to the media statement from the minister, of ambient air quality levels considered safe for the Murujuga rock art has been made. It will be refined as the program continues. I don't know whether that's a signal of what you're about to talk about, but are there worrying signs about going forward?
There's worrying signs right now, in fact, if you read deeper into the report. So the thing that we need to be aware of, this is one, let's just get past it immediately. This is one of the most important cultural heritage sites in Australia, and it's probably the most important rock art site in the world. The rock art all sits in a surface layer, which is very, very thin, just a few millimeters thin. And below that is the parent rock. But the rock art all sits in that surface layer. So it's what's going on in that surface layer that is absolutely crucial. And that surface layer contains manganese and iron mainly, and a whole bunch of clays. Now, what this report has sought to do, so that what they've been asked to do for the last 5 years, is to see what effect industrial emissions, so pollution, is having on that layer. Now, we know the pollution is very extreme. There's thousands of tons of dust of NOx, and so nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxides going up into the air, and that all lands on the rocks. And so this report has done a number of things. So what they've done, they had a climate chamber, for example, and they've subjected the rock to nitric acids and sulfuric acids. And what they found is that rock does start to degrade. And in the report, they own up to that and say, yes, there is evidence that this rock degrades with nitric acid and sulfuric acid that we know is on the rocks. What's less clear, unless you really read into the text, is that they only did that on the parent rock. Now, the parent rock is much harder. It's a very different beast. The actual surface is what we're interested in, which is an entirely different color, entirely different geology. Unfortunately for them, we have in our own labs subjected under exactly the same conditions rocks with that surface layer to the same levels of acidity. And what we have found for all of the rocks on Murujuga is that if you subject that surface layer to acidity below 6, it starts to degrade. Now, in this report, they say they didn't find any evidence of degrading of manganese or iron.
Yep.
Well, they wouldn't, because manganese and iron is only in that surface layer. It's not a part of the actual rock. It's part of the crust that has formed on top of the rock.
But does it surprise you, though, that when they say that the report shows that levels of pollutants such as nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide have actually gone down since about 2014? Is that...
Not clear that they say that. So they acknowledge that their evidence is supporting industry's evidence, and all of us have always been going off. So Woodside and Yarra, and they all have to report their levels of pollution, and all scientists have been using those reported levels of pollution. So, and those are not showing. The reported pollution is not going down. So I don't think that the pollution is going down. Woodside's never claimed that. None of the industry up there has claimed that. So we kind of know the levels of pollution. What this report says is that they found evidence that the pollution was slightly higher than has been reported, but it's in the same broad area. So we're all working with the same data. We all agree on the levels of pollution. I don't think there's any difference of opinion between industry and anyone else on that. The pollution levels are very high, and they contain a lot of nitrogen oxide, which is extremely caustic and damaging when mixed with water. So one of the findings that is really significant, that is in the report and is a clear part of the conclusion, is that they find, and I'll use their exact words, that there is a statistically significant evidence of elevated porosity of granifier surfaces in an area within Murujuga region. This speaks to some of the wording, I think, an area within Murujuga region. It is actually there on the map. You can see where they found it.
Right.
And it's right between Woodside and Yarra, so it's right in the industrial section.
Yep.
And what that means, is when you say porosity, what it means is that a rock that is pretty strong and fairly dense in its structure. When it's porous, it means that there are holes in the surface and that stuff is able to penetrate into that surface. Now, this is exactly what we have found happens in our own lab experiments, that when you subject those Murujuga rocks to the levels of pollution that exist coming out of industry on Murujuga, that surface starts to degrade and starts to become a lot more porous. And the reason for that is that the manganese first starts to come off, then some of the clays, and then last the iron at about a pH of 4. So that the finding of this porosity, although they neglect to interpret why it has happened, is something that we can understand. It is a direct product of the industrial emissions on Murujuga.
Okay.
And what it is a sign of, and it's a really important sign, it's a sign that it's not just that the emissions will damage the rocks, they are already damaging the rocks. And I'll give you another piece of evidence. So we were very lucky in our experiments that Robert Bednarik, who's stood up for the Burrup for many years, collected a piece of rock before Woodside built its major gas processing plant in that same area. And we've been able to compare that rock, so it's a pre-industrial rock, with rocks in exactly the same area today. And what we found is that that piece of rock from before didn't have any of this porosity. It was very rich in manganese, so that darker layer, and that the rocks we collect in the same area today, where we align exactly with what this report states, are highly porous, and the manganese is almost entirely gone. So what their evidence, when you combine it with our evidence, is showing is that not only will the industrial pollution damage the rock art, it already has, and very significantly. So that we're looking at rocks where the manganese has basically been completely eroded from the surface, and that porosity is kind of the last ditch phase where that whole surface is starting to break down. The clays are going, and the iron will be the next thing to go. It's a very, very serious finding, and a lot should have been made of it in the conclusions, but weren't.
I'll come to that in a sec. I'm talking to Professor Benjamin Smith, who's a world rock art expert from the UWA. One thing, a line here, and this is only in the media statement. As I said, I haven't been able to plough through the 800 pages that you've been able to at least look at. It says, current evidence suggests that this occurred in terms of that elevated porosity. Current evidence suggests this occurred during periods of significantly higher industrial emissions in the 1970s. So they're all like saying sort of, this is from years back.
If only. There were very low emissions in the 1970s because there was no one emitting pollution there except for the boats. So that would have been mainly sulfuric acid. No, we know the pollution. So we've got the pollution curve for Murujuga. It's been steadily going up, and it's close to its peak. It's at very dangerous levels by international standards. Thousands of tons of nitrogen oxide released every year. That's serious pollution by any scale. Any chemist or geologist will tell you that.
All right. And then, of course, we'll now hear, though, whether or not it is considered safe and, of course, palatable to allow Woodside and the North West Shelf gas project to go on for up to 45 years into the future. What's your view?
We shouldn't delude ourselves with the evidence presented here. The evidence, if you look into the detail, it's really worrying what has been presented here, and there are absolutely definitive signs that the rock art is eroding. And we don't have to only look at this report for that. We have a PhD produced at the University of Bonn by a completely impartial student that has demonstrated absolutely categorically that those industrial emissions are damaging the rock art.
Just before I let you go, I will play. So I did speak, of course, earlier to the guy who's sort of there as the independent stakeholder reference group chair. That's Professor Stephen Van Leeuwen, about his views on what the report found, and he said this:
the scientific evidence that has been obtained through this report, and acknowledging this is a exceptionally strong, rigorous report, and it follows on previous studies on the Burrup, and one I was involved in probably 30 years ago, looking at it, and every time we have these reports, the ability to detect change improves as technology and analytical processes improve. A bit of the boffinry gets better.
Yep.
And at the moment, the scientists are telling us that the emissions are extremely low, and those levels of emission are not impacting as on the rock art as proposed by other proponents who are suggesting that it's forming acid rain and acid surfaces on the desert varnish or patina on the rocks that is eroding away. The results are saying that's not the case.
All right.
What's your reaction?
The boffinry does get better. 20 years ago, it might have been possible to pull the wool. It's not possible now, unfortunately. We have a 300-page PhD at the University of Bonn, written by entirely neutral, independent people who had really no interest in finding one way or the other that is absolutely clear-cut. On the other side, we have a government-funded, industry-funded report that does have a lot of the key evidence that shows the damage is happening, but where the conclusions have been quite carefully crafted in a way that's not clear.
Benjamin Smith, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Professor Benjamin Smith there.